And good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us this morning. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah. I'm all wired up with all sorts of things, so yeah. So as long as I'm not too loud or too quiet, that's good.
You're glowing green.
I'm glowing green, am I? Well, it wouldn't be unusual. Okay, yes, as Bianca said, I was in the RNZAF for 33 years. I joined as a logistics officer, although I did work in other non-logistics posts and served overseas or around the world in a number of occasions. But my first deployment overseas, or first time, was actually as the Squadron Logistics Officer on Number 2 Squadron, which was, as Bianca said, was deployed to Australia from 91 through to 2001. What I'm going to be doing today, or not doing today, is I'm not going to be talking about the aircraft so much. I mean, there are others who are eminently more qualified than me to talk about the Skyhawk, but obviously the Skyhawk and its operations were central to why we were there. And while the squadron was there for 10 years, I'm really going to be focusing on the first 3 years, which was the time I was on the unit, and which involved the moving there, the deploying there, the setting up of operations and the early operations. So I'll be looking at 91 through to 93. Having said that, at this point it is appropriate to acknowledge that the squadron was there for 10 years and it was an extremely successful deployment, which sadly had a tragic ending in that in 2001 was quite a difficult year. Not only was it the year that the strike force, including the Skyhawks, were disbanded, but on 2 Squadron there were 2 aircraft crashes. One aircraft crashed off the coast of Perth. Fortunately, the pilot ejected. But unfortunately, another crash at NOWRA involving the squadron commander at the time, squadron leader Murray Nielsen, or Muzzer, he actually crashed there and died as a result of that. So I just wanted to recognise that ending to the deployment, and in particular Muzzer, who was one of the COs. Okay, 2 Squadron. This is its crest, Whakatopa kia mate. We swoop to kill the winged tahia. The squadron actually, it's probably one of the lesser known squadrons compared to some of the other New Zealand ones, but in actual fact had quite a history. It was formed prior to World War II in the Wellington region. Its roles were coastal and maritime defence, and it flew the Vickers Wildebeest. The Wildebeest, of course, is currently being restored here at the museum. It got significant battle honours during World War II, flying Hudsons and Venturers, and then after the war it was a Territorial Air Force squadron flying P-51 Mustangs out of Ohakea until 1957, when it was disbanded. And of course later it was reformed with the Skyhawk. As I said, the squadron was in NOWRA for 10 years, from 91 through to 2001, and what you have here is a photograph of 2 of the squadron aircraft. I'm not sure which year this was taken, but it's a good scene setter. You can see the squadron emblems on the tail. This area underneath them is the northern part of the base. Now, Naval Air Station NOWRA also was known as HMAS Albatross, in line with naval convention that all facilities have a ship's name. You can see the end of the main runway there. Typical Australian sort of landscape, and in the distance there, that's the township of NOWRA. So the base was actually on a slight plateau, which brought about some challenges, which I'll cover later, and it was about 10 kilometres distance from NOWRA. NOWRA itself, just to orientate you, and this is, I apologise, this is not a particularly good, it's just something I found online, but NOWRA is actually located in Jervis Bay, which is an absolutely beautiful part of Australia. Incredible beaches and coastline. It's about 2 hours south of Sydney along the Princes Highway, and similarly it's about 2 hours inland to Canberra. So it's quite centrally located, and it was a very, very nice place to be. And so if you haven't been there and you ever go to that part of the world, I'd certainly recommend that you go down and have a look at Jervis Bay. It is quite beautiful. Okay, today in the presentation, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the background of the deployment, why we were there, the deployment itself, getting to NOWRA, the squadron organisation I'll just touch on to give you a picture of how the squadron was set up, just a sort of an overview as to what our operations were, and included in that is I'll be talking about the deployments within Australia. While the squadron was set up in NOWRA, it was always right from the start recognised as being operating around Australia, and we deployed extensively, certainly during my time. We'll just cover a few of the operating challenges. I do have a video that I'll just show at the end, which will give you a bit of it's a bit more wary. It'll give you a sort of a sense of what the squadron did, and then there'll be an opportunity for questions at the end. Okay, a little bit about the background, a little bit of history here as to why we're here. The RNZAF, as I'm sure most of you, or many of you will be aware, purchased the Skyhawk in 1970. Bought 14 aircraft, 10 single-seaters, 4 two-seaters. A couple of aircraft were lost in the early years. And as we got into the 1980s, the fleet was about 12. Concurrent to that, the Australian Navy was operating the Skyhawk along with Grumman tracker aircraft off HMAS Melbourne, which was their aircraft carrier. Home based at NOWRA, but operating at sea on the Melbourne. The Australian government made the decision in the early 80s to decommission and dispose of Melbourne, and the plan was that the Skyhawks would return to NOWRA and would continue to conduct operations land-based. That only really happened for a couple of years, and in about 1983, early 84, Australia made the decision to dispose of a fixed-wing component to the fleet air arm and just focus solely on rotary or helicopters. And that is the way it is today. So their 10 remaining Skyhawks, which were A4Gs, were sold to New Zealand, and in 1984 arrived, and 2 Squadron was formed as the second squadron to operate those. And in fact, this photo here is in the 80s. It's 4 of the Squadron T-Birds. The top one has been through the Project Kahu upgrade and is painted in the scheme that they were operated in NOWRA. Obviously, this was the outgoing Vietnam era brown and green colour scheme, and the middle 2 aircraft are still in their Navy colours. The squadron was formed with the role of being the A4 conversion unit, training pilots and technicians to convert onto the Skyhawk. And it also had a secondary role of procedures and tactics development. And it did that through the 80s, operating at Ohakea. In the late 80s, all the Skyhawks went through Project Kahu, which was a project to upgrade them, putting in new avionics and systems, making them compatible with precision strike weapons, and bringing all of the aircraft, the New Zealand and the Aussie ones, up to the same standard. Now, while all this was going on, the Australian Navy had relied on the Australian Air Force and contracted Learjets to provide this aggressor maritime strike enemy training that was essential to the ships to work up their combat capabilities. For various reasons, and I don't know, that didn't really work out to their satisfaction, and the Australians were noticing there was a decline in the training that their ships were getting. And so the Australian government approached New Zealand and asked about the possibility of deploying some Skyhawks back to Australia. Oh, wrong there, this one here. Too many things. That resulted in 1990 in the signing of a treaty between Australia and New Zealand, number 25, signed on the 13th of July, which basically agreed that New Zealand would provide a squadron of Skyhawks back to Australia to support them. Within that treaty, there was an implementing agreement, and we will look at some of this, which outlined who does what, who's responsible, how it was all going to work. And that covered 5 years. That was subsequently renewed in 96 through to 2001 with an enhanced agreement, which sort of took the lessons learned of the first 5 years and integrated them in and moved forward. Now, of course, 2001 was the year that New Zealand made the decision to disband the strike force, and so 2 Squadron came home, and the agreement came to an end at that point. Pure speculation on my part, but I would imagine with the way that the agreement had gone over the first 10 years, that had the Skyhawks remained in service, then they probably would have stayed there with a revised agreement, because it had been a very successful arrangement. So, what did it cover? Within the agreement, the 2 Squadron would fly 800 hours a year in what they called ADF flying. So that is flying that was directly in support of the Australian Defence Force, primarily the Australian Navy. The first 400 would be paid by New Zealand, the second 400 would be paid by Australia, and there was also an allowance for up to 280 hours per year for transit flying in Australia. Because as I said earlier, it wasn't all conducted out of NOWRA. We operated, as you'll see later, all around Australia, and of course you had to get the aircraft there. So that had to be allowed for. Plus there was an additional 400 hours, or up to 400, which was for the Squadron to do the conversion and training of New Zealand pilots onto the Skyhawk. So, you know, if those who can do the quick maths, 1,480 hours a year over 6 aircraft, and a squadron of only 55 personnel was a really busy squadron. The flying hour costs they agreed as part of the agreement was $2,056 an hour. A bargain, I would have thought, at that point. But $2,000 35 years ago was a little bit more money than it probably was today. I wouldn't even want to think what it would cost now. But that was the price that was agreed. Now, if you looked at that, you might actually think that the Aussies were getting a pretty good deal. You know, we were paying for most of it. And indeed, we were paying for a lot of it. However, the Australians actually had to do some significant investment for the Squadron to go across. And they actually, at the time, spent around about $8 million on various upgrades. They had to reinstate the emergency arrestor gear, which had been taken out of service. And for those of you who don't know, the aircraft, the A4s for normal braking would use a parachute. However, when they lost something like hydraulics, they would lose braking, they would lose some of the systems, and therefore they would have to have the arrestor gear to land. So that had to be reinstalled. There were various tarmac improvements. The Australians had to build a number of small workshops around the hangar for us, for armoury and for avionics and so forth. And they had to actually upgrade the airfield or runway lighting and nav aids for the A4s. In addition, under the agreement, they provided housing for the married people on the Squadron. There was about 20 odd on the first push, and so the Aussies provided furnished housing. New Zealand paid rent for it, but they had to organise and provide that housing and various other things like medical support for the personnel in that. So actually it was a significant investment that Australia actually put in to NOWRA to bring the aircraft back. New Zealand continued to cover maintenance, the salaries of all of us and all of our various personnel costs. Looking at the command, 2 Squadron was an RNZAF squadron. It remained under RNZAF command. It was commanded through Ohakea, OC Strike, and so that didn't change. However, there's a thing called operational control, OPCON. OPCON is when someone is given the authority to task or direct a military asset. So operational control for the 800 hours was given to the Maritime Commander of Australia. So essentially the Australians would task the squadron, tell us what to do, when to do it, and so forth. I mentioned though that the secondary role of the squadron was conversion training of our own pilots, and so the operational control of that remained with New Zealand. Now, might seem a bit complicated, it actually wasn't. Essentially, the CO and the Ops Flight Commander, whenever they did the daily flying planning and tasking and that, they would put the flying into 2 buckets. It would either be controlled by the Australians because it was tasked, or they would be controlled by New Zealand because it was training and that. It actually was a very, very smooth and efficient way of doing it and allowed us to keep track of all of the activities. Okay, this is the deployment. We'll just talk a bit about that. This is Jervis Bay. Three of the squadron aircraft flying over Jervis Bay. Beautiful beaches, lovely bush. This here is actually HMAS Creswell, which is the Australian Navy's officer training facility not far from NOWRA, where they all go for their initial training. Beautiful spot. All of these beaches, just as an aside, are very popular public beaches. This one here and this one here are actually on defence land, and no one can go there unless you're actually defence, Australian defence, and fortunately for us, we were included in that. So we were very privileged to be able to go down to the stunning beaches and there would be no one there while all the masses were up here. So that was one of the perks of the posting we had here. But a lovely part of the world, and as I say, if you get the opportunity to go there, I'd recommend it. Right, when we talk about deployments, you often think about just going and doing something for a short time. There's a bit of a misnomer around the word here. What was happening was the squadron and all of the stuff that's required to support a squadron in Ohakea, a whole bunch of that was picked up, taken across to NOWRA and dropped down. And so, for example, when it came to maintenance, not only was the first line, flight line maintenance done by the squadron, but so was the more intermediate level. The aircraft only came back to New Zealand for depot level maintenance, and we would send back or swap over a couple of aircraft about once every 4 months. Everything else was done at NOWRA, along with a lot of the administration and a lot of the logistic support was all done at NOWRA. So, as you can imagine, there was a sizable move of equipment that needed to go across. And so initially that equipment was put into 20-foot containers and taken across by commercial shipping, arriving in January 91. Spares, a spare J52 engine, and if you want to see what one of those looks like, it's out actually in the aircraft hall on its stand. The TARDIS, I'll talk about that later, pack up. These were all packed up and flown across in two C-130s. The advance party of the squadron, which I was the OIC of, and I think it was about 14 or 15 plus families, we flew in direct from New Zealand on a 727 on the 11th of February. And over the next 2 weeks, our role was to get ourselves sorted into our homes, go out, buy things like cars, just get ourselves settled, groceries, all that sort of stuff. But at the same time, we had to start unpacking all the equipment, trying to set up the hangar, the ops headquarters, as much as we can in that 2-week period, and obviously ensure that everything was placed for the rest of the squadron, which arrived on the 28th of February. So all of those, the rest of the squadron and families flew in again on a 727 on the 28th. So that was a really busy 2 weeks. Peak of summer, 40 degrees. It was hard work, but it was quite satisfying. As I say, the squadron arrived on the 28th of February. Reception, families were sort of given hosts and that. The pilots jumped back on the Boeing, flew up to Williamtown, where the 2 squadron jets had been used on an exercise by 75 Squadron, and so later that afternoon the boys bought and it was boys all at that stage, bought all of the A4s back. For those of you that saw the Herc come in, you'll be aware of, the streets were busy with people to see the Herc land. Well, it was like that at Albatross. I remember it well. The base was out in mass. The streets or the roads around the base were full of people who were stopping because the jets were coming back to NOWRA, and it was quite a moving experience to see them fly over in formation and realise that we were now there and it was starting. Getting established, we shared a hangar, J hangar, with 816 Squadron, which was an Australian squadron bringing into service the Sikorsky Seahawk helicopter, and we shared the headquarters building with them. And as I mentioned earlier, the ADF had built new workshops. These had to be set up. We just had to basically unpack and get settled into a routine. And at the same time, squadron members were having to move into their houses, go out and buy cars. NOWRA wasn't a huge town. I reckon the car market actually did pretty well. Something like about 30 plus cars were bought in the space of about 3 weeks by squadron people. An awful lot of Mitsubishi Magnas and Ford Falcons were all bought, but all that had to be done. Kids had to be enrolled in schools, all the things of getting settled. The NOWRA community was very, very welcoming and largely very positive. There'd been a gap of about 6-7 years since the jets left, and they were really quite pleased to hear them, as I used to say, the sound of freedom overhead. And it was very, very welcoming overall. Similarly, the Australian Navy were welcoming. The base command there and that were very accommodating and couldn't have done anything more for us. But there was an element of the Australian Navy that was a little less welcoming. And it's understandable. There was still a lot of anger, almost, among some of the Fleet Air Arm personnel, known as birdies, and particularly those guys who had serviced or worked on the A4s. There was quite a bit of frustration that their government had actually got rid of the carrier and the A4s. And on top of that, they were a little bit agitated by the fact that New Zealand had bought them and were now bringing them back. So it wasn't huge, but there was this sort of slight resentment there that we had to deal with, and it manifested itself with things like, you know, a mannequin in a noose with a New Zealand flag around hanging in the hangar, just general sort of commentary around the base that you guys are bringing our jets back and so forth. We knew that, we confronted it, and the squadron made a huge effort to get involved in the base, socially in all the messes, joining groups, where we could, giving backseat rides to some Australians, just doing things, and it very quickly dissipated. And within a year or less, we were part of the furniture on the base and very, very welcoming. But, you know, it was, when we first got there, it was something that we were conscious of and were determined to work through. And we did. So while we were doing all of that, of course, the Australians were very keen to start using us. So very quickly we started getting into operations. The aircrew had to fly and get used to the local training areas, and then we started getting some tasking. Okay, looking at the squadron organisation, this was a squad. This was taken in '92. That's the squadron, the classic, you know, fighter V thing that you do. A couple I'll just point out there which might be of interest. This here is Anthony Fraser. He was one of the students at that time. Fraser came back to New Zealand on 75, subsequently banged out of an A4, and in fact, if you go in to where the A4 is, you'll see Fraser's helmet that he was wearing at the time that he banged out. And Jason Eastie, standing next to me. Eastie was a bogey junior pilot. He actually ended up being the last CO of 2 Squadron when they were disbanded, and then he went to Australia. Okay, so the squadron, as I mentioned before, 6 Skyhawks. They were rotated through. Normally, it was about 3 single-seaters and 3 two-seaters. Approximately 55 personnel. 6 of those were ops pilots, i.e. fully qualified pilots who could fly the Australian tasking, including the boss, OFC, and the Ops Flight Commander and the training officer. Always had a couple of conversion pilots on going through on a course. 2 of them would arrive from New Zealand in January. They would take about 6 months to do their conversion. At the end of their conversion, they would go on and be the junior ops pilots, and the other 2 would then go back to New Zealand. Another 2 students come through, and it had this rotation through. An engineering officer or maintenance flight commander, a supply air movements officer, which was what I was, warrant officer, and about 40 technicians, suppliers and admin. Personnel, we lived in Navy housing, as I mentioned. Single people lived on base, and we continued to be administratively and technically commanded through base Ohakea. So a small squadron, only 55 personnel, and as a result, a busy one. Squadron execs, when we first arrived, here there's actually 5 missing. It was Squadron Stu McKenzie, the Ops Flight Commander. I don't know where he was that day. This is at an Anzac parade. Phil Wilson was the training officer. He went on to a civil aviation career. Graham Harris was the engineering or maintenance flight commander. Graham actually, after the Air Force, eventually became the director of CAA in New Zealand. The boss, Steve Moore, he stayed on in the Air Force and retired as the deputy chief, and myself. Okay, squadron operations. This is what we did. This is the bread and butter of why we were there. A couple of the A4s flying over HMAS Newcastle. Squadron had 2 roles, as I've touched on. First one was fleet support. What does that mean? It's maritime strike, aggressor training, being the bad guy, the enemy, to exercise predominantly Royal Australian Navy ships in air defence, because this was part of working them up to full combat capability. And in addition to that, the squadron also got tasked to do aggressor or dissimilar air combat training with Australian F-18s up at Williamtown. But predominantly the work was with supporting the Australian ships. And in addition, the A4 conversion was the second role of the squadron, 2 6-month courses per year. Now, just looking at fleet support, specifically what is it? As I said, it's aggressor training. You're working with Australian ships as part of their workup programs. This is after they'd been alongside for maintenance or tied up for a while. Once they start sailing, they have to actually train and then show that they've now reached a level of combat capability, and that includes their ability to deal with a submarine threat and, in our case, an air threat. And so that was one of the roles. Also, we were there just at the end of the Gulf War, and the Australians were heavily committed with sending frigates up to the Gulf, and that was a high threat environment, so therefore they went through extensive workup programs which we were part of, and then just being part of routine Royal Australian Navy exercises. We worked alongside Learjets, civilian Learjets that were operated by a company out of NOWRA. They actually provided good training as well. Not quite the training that the A4 could, because the Learjet is a different sort of aeroplane. But for example, some of the profiles you would fly would be a Skyhawk and a Learjet, and they would be simulating a standoff missile where the Skyhawk and the Learjet would go in, the Skyhawk would pull away, and the Learjet would carry on as if it was a missile. So there was that sort of training. And as I mentioned, there was support to the RAAF 18s. Squadron, there was a lot of media coverage, especially in the first 2 years. As one of my secondary roles was the Squadron Information Officer, and there would not be a month go by that there wasn't a request for a TV station or a media organisation to come in and do it. So we had 60 Minutes, we had TVNZ, the various Australian channels, they all visited and did profiles of the squadron. And this here is just an example, something that appeared in the Australian Defence Report in July that year after the squadron arrived. So a lot of media interest in Australia about what we were doing, but probably there was a bit of a political slant as to why we were back doing it when the Australians would get it. But as I say, that was noise that was beyond us, but there was certainly interest in the squadron. Deployments in Australia. Now, and I'm going through these, just hopefully it's at a pace that you're comfortable with. We deployed extensively. And I'm just going to talk a bit about that now. This was sort of a bit of a bread and butter for me. This photo here, we went to Townsville in 1992. This is where the squadron deployed on a major exercise with the Australian number 77 squadron flying F-18s. You can see the aircraft on the line. Very tragically, on that exercise, one of the F-18s did actually impact the ground during a strike alongside our Skyhawks. And neither of the crew ejected, which was very sad, and certainly brought home to us the risks and the challenges of fast jet operations. But in the 3 years I was there, we did about 20 deployments. Just summarising them, a couple to Darwin. There was attendance of the 70th anniversary air show, Richmond. A couple to Perth. I'll talk about, these were big deployments. A lot of work went into them. Townsville, the one I just talked about. Participation at the Australian International Air Show in '92. The Skyhawks, of course, at that stage were flying, their party piece was the plugged barrel roll. We were down there doing that. This is actually a photo of me doing my shift, standing at the front giving out stickers to people. And numerous deployments up to Williamtown, probably about 10 or 11. Now, this is where, we get away from the aeroplane and more into the background stuff. When we went to Williamtown, we would get air support whenever we moved from the Australian Air Force. But when we went to Williamtown, which was a mere 5 hours up the road, we didn't get it. So obviously the jets would fly, 30 minutes up to Williamtown, they'd be in the bar. The rest of us had a huge truck, a bus, and we would make our way through Sydney, a couple of McDonnell stops, and we would eventually follow them up there. And we'd go up there, as I say, for deployments of usually 1 or sometimes 2 weeks. Elsewhere in Australia was more challenging. This was where the Australian Air Force would provide C-130 support. Normally we would get just the one C-130. If we had to take a spare engine, we'd get two, but normally it was just one. As I'm going to show you in a few minutes, that was quite a complex move to move there. But we would have to go there. When we actually deployed to these locations, it was quite complex because we would have to follow and support the jets. The A4 is not a modern, self-sufficient, easy start, minimal care aircraft. It has a huge tail behind it, and it is very ground support dependent. So whenever we deployed to those locations, it would be a plan which would see the jets launched, usually to a transit refueling stop. We would be in the Herc, loaded up with everything else. We would follow them. We would arrive after the A4s. They'd have a couple of groundies in the back seats if they had the T-birds. They would have done a refuel. We would arrive, get the gear off, check them, make sure they're okay, start them. They'd be airborne again. We'd then follow, and we'd eventually get to our destination and do that as many times as we had to. So it was always quite a complex thing deploying them across Australia because it's not a small country, as we know. When we deployed by air, the C-130, the main provider was 37 Squadron, this is a photograph of a couple of their aircraft. They were very much into strategic moves. C-130Es, pretty much like C-130H, but just some subtle differences. Now this is a load plan. I've just put this in here to show you. So this is a Herc load plan, and this is just to show you, and you'll see some photos in a minute of what that actually meant, of how we moved around Australia. We'd be able to configure about seating, shoulder to shoulder, knee to knee for 22 people there. We would have these pallets, the TARDIS. The TARDIS, which I'll show you a photo of in a second, it was an ingenious kit. It was where all our spares were. It was an aircraft pallet with a custom-built huge box that was concertina storage on it. When it was fully loaded, it would be about 7,000 or 8,000 pounds. And that would be sitting in the middle, or put it another way, about 3,000 kilos. It's a box, and when it's in the aircraft, it rattles, it creaks, it groans, it shakes, and it clangs. And it was always, you got used to it, but it was always interesting watching the new boys on the Squadron sitting there, flying along in turbulence with this massive green box that was just making every noise that you can possibly think of behind you. Could be a bit disconcerting, but it was a great piece of kit. We'd have the rest of the Squadron equipment there. We'd always have a ground turbine compressor on the back because that's what we needed to take off to start the jets en route, and other pieces of equipment. Just looks like a drawing there, but believe me, it was one cramped aircraft. Sometimes we could get additional support from the Navy, and we would have, if we wanted to take extra people on some deployments, not all, but some, we could actually get tasked to support us one of their 748s. They had a couple of those at NOWRA, and they would take you as well. We actually had one deployment where some of the groundies, fortunately I wasn't on that one, actually flew from NOWRA across to Perth in a very leisurely 11-hour flight in the back of one of these things to support the deployment. I was in the Herc. Must have pulled rank or something, I don't know. Okay. Now this is when we went to Williamtown, but this is just to show you, this is what the load in the Herc would have looked like. There's your TARDIS, heavily chained and stropped. There's all of your equipment, ground power units, GTCs on a massive articulated truck, but all of that would slide, be built like that, and would slide into the Herc. You're probably talking around about 18 to 20,000 pounds of equipment. As I say, the A4 was not a light aircraft to move around, and particularly if you were operating 5 or 6 of them in a deployed environment, you always knew that you were going to have some unserviceabilities and, worst case, an engine change or something like that. So, we basically just had to take everything. And that included, for example, ground power units, GTCs, spare engines, equipment, test equipment, drag chutes. I mentioned earlier that the A4 used a drag chute. Unless the runway, like Darwin, was particularly long and then it could just roll out, Normally it was a chute. If you've got 3 waves of 4 aircraft today, there's 12 chutes. So you had to carry spares, but also you had to carry the equipment for the guys to repack those for the next day's ops. So I've sort of put a comment there. It was a bit like going on a family camping trip. You weren't sure what the weather's going to be like or what's going to happen, so you take everything just in case. And that was the reality of supporting the jet over there. Okay, you've all seen our Z6254 sitting out in the atrium here over here. This is her when she was on the Squadron at NOWRA. That's J hangar, which was the Squadron hangar in the background and a bit of a flight line hut. And yeah, there she is there in the heyday, sitting out there. Unlike out there now, where she's in a sort of an all-green screen, this was the colour scheme that the aircraft had during the early 90s, the grey and green. We're getting there. Challenges. There were a few. The supply line was the biggest issue. If you can imagine, you had equipment. Ohakea was the main base. Obviously, equipment and supplies and spares would come in from manufacturers to Ohakea. We, of course, were operating a busy operation over at NOWRA over here, so there was a supply line there. And then, of course, if we were deployed around Australia, as we frequently were, you had that. So we did have always an ongoing challenge of making sure we had the right components in place at the right time. Unfortunately, that did often see us having one of the aircraft cannibalised, which is not a good thing, really, because it's inefficient and it's not good to be pulling bits off an aeroplane to get another one going, but that just was the reality. And so we always, well, not always, but we often had a hangar queen, which would actually reduce us down to 5 aircraft for operations. And out of that 5, we would try and get 4 on the line every day. And that affected us tasking. What do I mean by that? It means that, you know, it wasn't uncommon that if you were planning a 4-ship strike in the morning, you'd get along and you'd find out that actually only 3 of the aircraft came up. So, you know, the aircrew would have to then replan their whole operation around 3 aircraft rather than 4. So it did have an impact on operations. The flying hours were high, as I mentioned, and there were some months where we almost flew 200 hours. And so, you know, if you've got a hangar queen or 1 aircraft that's unserviceable, you're talking about up to 200 hours of 5 airframes in the course of 1 month. A high workload for the pilots, but a very high maintenance and support workload for everybody else on the squadron. High summer temps. I mentioned way at the beginning that the NOWRA is on a bit of a plateau, and for whatever reason, the 2 runways which intersected started and then went slightly downhill, crossed at a low point, and then went up again. During the summer, one of the challenges for the jets was, particularly if they were loaded with a couple of drop tanks, because of where the exercises were, and you're talking 35 higher days, and you're talking a slight dip, it was always quite interesting to watch them get airborne. They would accelerate down the runway and would almost like they were physically slow down at the low point and then have to re-accelerate. And we used to jokingly say that sometimes we don't think the aircraft really got airborne, rather the curvature of the earth just allowed them to actually get off the ground. But joking aside, there was some pretty close calls, if you like, and some of the HUD tapes from the pilots were actually quite scary to watch as the runway was coming up fast, the end of it. So, you know, temperatures in NOWRA were a operational planning consideration, and often would drive what the squadron could do, how long they could go out to a training area and that for fuel loads and so forth. Perhaps besides the supply line, one of the other interesting ones was the NOWRA work routine. HMS Albatross had a 4.5-day week. They finished on Friday at midday, which was a bit frustrating because we were a heavily tasked unit. There would be flying pretty much every day, and there was certainly maintenance every day. And in fact, we would often run 2 shifts of people late into the night to get the aircraft ready for the next days. So, and when at the end of a working day and at 12 o'clock on a Friday, when they shut down, the operational area would become a restricted area. And if you wanted to move in it, you had to ring the guardhouse and tell them that you were moving from here to there and whatever. You can imagine when you're trying to do your normal business and operating aircraft, and that became a bit of a frustration. So in terms of the guys on the squadron, that was probably one of the things that actually we really had to get used to, and it did take some getting used to. And just, I've got here differences in Navy Air Force culture. This wasn't a biggie, but it was just something that was there. I mean, we were an Air Force unit. Everything we did was around airworthiness and operational usage and efficiency of the jets. And it was the same for the Fleet Air Arm guys. They were also, that was very much something they focused on. But they were on a base that was essentially a ship. And so things like terminology, work routines, just some of the expectations of how you do business were different between the Air Force and the Navy. And we constantly had to just make sure that we were adapting to that. But, it worked, and it actually made for quite a unique experience. Bianca, we're just going to try this. I tried this this morning and it didn't work, so I'll get Bianca to see if she can do it for me. What I've got now, before we have some questions, is just a 4-minute video. It's off YouTube. Some of you will have seen it, I'm sure. It was taken at 2 Squadron in 1991 when we first got there. I apologise, it is quite grainy and a bit dark in places. It is a 35-year-old piece of film, but it will give you a sense of what the squadron was all about. That's taking off out of NOWRA at the end of it. Jarvis Bay. Yeah, oh, thank you. Yeah, so that just gives you a bit of an insight. I reckon the guy with the rifle was the last line of defence, but I don't know, it would be an unlucky day if he actually hit you. But yeah, look, that sort of is the end of it. It just brings us to the end. Oh, we don't want that one. No, it'll bring us to any questions that we have. Right there, just down there.